Okay, so the next step in this painting is that you're going to mix up your colors. Now if you're in oil, I can mix my entire palette all at once. Those of you in acrylic, you're going to have to pick and choose when you want to make each color. I would suggest doing each color at a time so you make a larger batch, and then you paint as you go. So if you are in acrylic, another trick is that as you're mixing your colors, you can have a little spray bottle with water in it and sort of mist your colors every once in a while, because you're going to be fighting against the dry time. Okay, so to make this a little bit easier, I put some of the pieces of paper from my color collage underneath my palette. That's sort of a trick. If you open up your picture frame, you can put them underneath the glass. That way as you're mixing, you have something to compare it to. You can also just hold it next to your palette if you don't want to take the glass out. So the goal is, as I mentioned in the PowerPoint, we are going to look for a highlight, the hue of the paper of it itself, and the shadow. We're not always going to mix a black to make the shadow and a white to make the highlight, but in some cases you might use a little bit of it. Okay. So let's start off. I've got all my colors from my color collage here, so let's just start off trying to mix the hues themselves. Now, here's my yellow background that I had. While it initially looks fairly yellow, it does have just a little bit of almost kind of an orangish hue to it as I look at it. You can kind of see it's not solid. Hold on, just grab one. So what I'm probably going to do, if I had to pick and choose between my two yellows, I'm going to pick the one that's a little bit warmer. I'm just going to see it to put it next to it. It's already fairly close itself, but I want to try to get it as close as possible. So I actually might mix just a hair of a little bit of my red. It's going to take it a little bit. Tiny hair. It's just going to make it a little bit warmer. As you can see, I can get pretty close. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of white. See how that made it just a little bit warmer? Always clean off your palette knife in between. That's where your rag comes in handy, because I'm trying not to taint my colors as I mix them. So I'm just going to add a little bit of white to this. Yes, I'm pretty close there. So I've been color mixing a lot. It might take you a little bit longer to get this, but just think you're going to try to edge towards the color that you want. So I'm just adding little nibs at a time. So now if I wanted to make just a little bit lighter version of this, I'm going to do the same thing. I could take from that pot. I'm going to mix a separate one just because I have a large area. I'm going to mix a lot more white this time. I'm just going to add just a nib of that red that I did before. Just kind of dull it out. I need a little bit more white to get in there. A large area. And then I want to mix a shadow. For this first round, we're just looking kind of at the overall shadows, but we're going to kind of alter it from there. But you might have different shadow parts against different colors depending on what color is casting the shadow. Now initially you might think for yellow I want to add black. What happens when you make a shadow out of black with yellow, it tends to be very blue. So I'm actually not going to use blue, or not going to use black to make my shadow. I'm going to mix a brown. If you have a brown, you could use that as one of your shadow colors. I'm going to go ahead and make up my own version of it. So I'm just going to take a few colors together to kind of mix a brown. I want to be able to mix the shadow that's closer to what I'm looking for. You know, the key to color mixing too is doing little bits at a time. I'm never going to go do too much at once, so especially if I have a very dark shadow color, just taking little nibs at a time is helpful. So see how that's actually a nicer dark orange. Just to give you an example of what would happen if I add black, it tends to give it, and I'm sure you already know from your color wheel, it tends to be greener. You can kind of see that versus that tends to be a warmer shadow. You could actually use either. There might be situations where you'd use either in your piece, but you know, kind of depends. All right. The other thing, as you guys are mixing, if you have questions, feel free to email me, take a picture of what color you're trying to match. So, certain colors tend to mix better. For example, my alizarin red is a little warmer, so I use it to make my shadow versus, a little cooler, so I'm using it to make my shadow, where my cadmium red is a little bit warmer, so I used it to kind of warm up my orange or warm up my yellow to get it closer to that kind of warm yellow. So you got to kind of look at the color and decide what to add, because just little tiny tints either way, or little hints of color, or how you're going to try to match the color paper that you have. So we've got a blue here. Now, this is obviously my closest blue. If I compare it to my ultramarine, this one's my cobalt, or my phthalo. If I had to think of a color that I need to add to this, doesn't it just edge a hair towards my green? So I just want to add just a little bit of yellow to it. Starts to get it a little bit closer. See how it's already a little closer? And then I'm going to go ahead and add some white to it. Now, if you have a really bright color, sometimes you have to build that through layering. You just want to get as close as you can, even if you can't get exactly the color. Pretty close. I'm just going to add a little bit more yellow, I think. And I'm adding my brighter yellow, not my duller yellow, to get there. Now, if I'm going to do my shadow, I'm actually going to use that same blue with that yellow again. And I could add a little bit of black to this, maybe, but even just not adding the white gives me a darker shade, right? But I think I might add just a little bit of black to this, just to keep going. The other thing that I could do for my shadow, just to give you an example, I'm going to mix my blue, and this time I'm going to add some phthalo, a little bit of yellow and some phthalo to it, and you'll see the difference that the shadow color makes. So that's my phthalo. Starts to get a little poppier, right? And then when I mix in a little bit of my red and yellow, just to kind of dull it out a little bit, because I don't want it super bright. Mix my phthalo into that. A little too purpley, so I'm going to add some of my yellow. So this is kind of a balance. Starting to get nice, starting to get where I want to go with that shadow, actually. Okay, you can see there's a subtle difference, but I could have used black. I'm going to do one more lighter version. So in essence, I'm going to go through and do this for all of my colors. Add a little bit of yellow to that. Too much. bit of a game, just getting the right amount. That's a little better. And once I have those mapped out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these on my, to map out my painting. What I'm going to do, this is for oil paint, I'm going to take some of my clean Gamsol, remember? Your clean Gamsol looks like this. It's in this container. This should be reserved for your paints. On our first layer of this painting, you're going to add Gamsol to clean it out, or to thin it out, to make it fluid. So I have enough to cover all of the painting. And you want it to be a little bit washy. We're just mapping out the general colors, so it's sort of a placeholder for what I do next. So I want to add a little bit of that to my paint. If you're using acrylic, you're going to add water. So you're going to thin out your acrylics just a little bit using water. That way you can stretch it out to get it to cover the whole thing. You also want your first layer to be sort of thinner base coat. That way it's going to allow the paint over top to adhere to it. And this is in a three-layer style of painting. So we're making the first layer sort of thinner and washier. Okay, so those are kind of the major steps. I still have a couple more colors I'm going to map out here very quickly. That's sort of the first major steps in mapping out your colors. But as I said, we are gonna, once I get these all mapped out, I'm gonna go to the next step and you're gonna see how we're gonna adhere these to our painting. Getting the last of these mapped out here. Running out of just a little bit of room.